Please subscribe and share for more story. Margaret Lowell was 76 when her son decided she was no longer capable of deciding things for herself. He came into her house that morning smiling too much, hugging her too tightly, his expensive cologne filling the hallway like an intrusion. "You'll thank me later, Mom," he said, as if kindness could excuse anything. Margaret felt it immediately. Something was wrong. Her son, Andrew, only visited when he needed something or when he was trying to hide something. He moved through her kitchen like it belonged to him, making coffee without asking, clattering the ceramic mugs she and her late husband once bought on their honeymoon. Then, casually leaning against the counter, he dropped it. "Oh, by the way, I sold your car. Got a decent deal." Margaret stared at him, the steam from her mug warming her face, while something colder settled in her chest. He kept talking, explaining rides to the pharmacy, errands handled for her. He never asked. He never paused. He assumed. And in that moment, Margaret understood exactly how her son saw her now, not as a woman, but as an inconvenience dressed in concern. The car Andrew sold was not just transportation. It was freedom. Margaret had bought the old blue Ford herself years after her husband, Thomas, passed away. It was the first large thing she owned in her own name, no signatures beside hers. She remembered driving it to the coast with the windows down, salt air tangling her hair, reminding her she was still alive. She remembered taking her granddaughter Lily to school, the small hand gripping hers across the console. There was a dent from a mailbox mishap and an air freshener that smelled faintly of pine and home. Andrew sold it like furniture. Worse, he sold it like it was his right. When he left, he patted her shoulder. "Just rest today, Mom." Margaret didn't answer. She watched him walk out, then noticed what sat in her driveway, his sleek black luxury car, far too loud for their quiet street. The keys lay on the hallway table, shining. Margaret picked them up without hesitation. She grabbed her purse, locked the door carefully, and stepped into a vehicle that was never meant for her, but would serve its purpose all the same. The engine purred when Margaret turned the key, arrogant and smooth. The smell inside was sharp, leather, plastic, a cologne trying too hard. She adjusted the seat, her feet barely reaching the pedals, and drove away. Past the rose bushes Thomas used to trim every spring. Past the neighbor's house with the red door where Mrs. Carver once waved every morning before she died. The roads were quiet, the sunlight creeping through old oak trees like a secret. For a moment, Margaret felt young again, like the girl who once borrowed her father's truck to meet Thomas by the reservoir. She didn't know where she was going. She only knew she couldn't stay still. Let Andrew wonder. Let him call. He thought she would accept whatever he decided for her. He didn't know her at all. Margaret drove until her joints reminded her she was no longer 20. She pulled into the parking lot of the Pinecrest Diner, an old place with peeling paint and a dead neon sign. She and Thomas used to stop there on long drives. He loved the meatloaf. She loved the pie. Something stayed. The bell above the diner door chimed softly as Margaret stepped inside. The place smelled like old coffee and memory. Red vinyl booths, cracked but familiar. The same man stood behind the counter, pencil tucked behind his ear, crosswords spread open. He looked up and nodded. "Coffee?" he asked. "Yes, please," Margaret replied, sliding into a corner booth. Through the window, Andrew's car sat like a stranger among rusted pickups. It didn't belong here. Neither did Andrew. He hated places like this, said they made him itch. Margaret sipped the coffee, bitter, honest. She hadn't brought her phone. She didn't need it. Andrew was probably pacing, deciding whether to panic or pretend everything was fine. She smiled into her cup. For once, she had left him waiting. She remembered buying the Ford years ago, signing the papers herself while Thomas smiled proudly. "A woman needs something that's hers," he'd said. Margaret hadn't understood fully then. She did now. The waitress refilled her cup and glanced out the window. "Nice car," she said. "Yours?" Margaret met her eyes. "For now." The girl smiled, understanding more than she asked. After the diner, Margaret drove slowly through parts of town she hadn't seen in years. Past the community center, where she once read to children. Past the empty lot where summer carnivals used to bloom with laughter. Past the church where Thomas's funeral had been held. Then she turned home. Not because she was finished, but because she needed to see it differently. She parked Andrew's car where her Ford once stood. Inside, the house smelled of lemon cleaner and old paper. Andrew's cologne lingered faintly. Margaret removed her coat neatly and sat at the kitchen table. She pulled out a notepad and wrote a heading, "Things that are mine." Under it, she listed her house, her name, her memories, her decisions. She underlined the last one twice. The phone rang at 1:17 p.m. She let it ring. By the third call, she turned the ringer off. She imagined Andrew standing in his driveway, confused, annoyed, afraid. Good. Let him feel unsteady. He had done that to her without a second thought. By late afternoon, there was a knock at the door. Sharp, confident. "Mom," Andrew called. "Are you home?" Margaret stayed seated. "I've been calling," he continued. "I just want to talk." His voice tightened. "I'm sorry about this morning. I didn't mean to surprise you." Margaret nearly laughed. "Surprise." He knocked again. "Is the car there?" His confidence wavered. That was the thing about people like Andrew. They were calm only when in control. She remained silent. Eventually, his footsteps retreated, a car door slammed, and an engine roared away. Only then did Margaret move to the window. Andrew hadn't noticed his car parked discreetly under the carport. She felt no triumph, only steadiness. She opened a drawer and looked through pieces of her life, receipts, postcards, certificates. At the bottom lay the original title to her Ford, still in her name. Andrew must have forged something, or lied. She closed the drawer calmly. Later. Not yet. Margaret opened her checkbook and reviewed the neat rows of her handwriting. Gifts to grandchildren. Thousands loaned to Andrew. Help offered without being asked. She stopped counting at 40,000. Quietly, she wrote a note. "You sold what was mine, so I took what was yours." She folded it, placed it in an envelope, and left it blank. That night, memories returned. The Ford wasn't just a car. After Thomas died, the silence in the house had nearly swallowed her. She sold his old sedan, bought the Ford outright, and drove it home with the windows down. It made her feel whole again. That car carried her through grief, errands, generosity. Andrew never liked it. Called it outdated. Unsafe. He always framed it as concern. He never worried when he needed money. Or when she was alone on holidays. That car represented independence, and Andrew removed it because he couldn't control it. The next morning, Margaret walked into the local bank with a folder tucked under her arm. "I need to change account access," she told the manager. Effective immediately. The manager hesitated. "Your son is listed on, remove him," Margaret said calmly. 40 minutes later, it was done. "Would you like to add someone else?" "My granddaughter Lily." "Not today." Outside, the air felt lighter. That afternoon, Margaret wrote to her lawyer, an old friend of Thomas's. "I need to revise my will and directives." She signed her name carefully. That evening, Lily called. "Grandma, did you take Dad's car?" Margaret smiled. "I borrowed it." Lily laughed. "You're kind of amazing." "Don't tell your mother," Margaret replied. Lily grew quiet. "He shouldn't have sold your car." "No," Margaret agreed. "He shouldn't have." Silence settled between them, not heavy, but understanding. The next day, Margaret rode the bus to her lawyer's office. She could have driven the luxury car, but this wasn't about drama. It was about intention. Inside the oak-paneled office, her lawyer greeted her warmly. "It's time I made things clear," Margaret said. They reviewed documents slowly. "I want my granddaughter as executor," she said. "My son is no longer to have control." The lawyer studied her. "You're certain?" "Yes," Margaret replied. "This isn't anger. It's clarity." When she left, autumn wind brushed her coat. At home, she made lunch and reviewed drafts. Andrew would call it betrayal. He wouldn't understand boundaries. But Margaret did. She stood at the window, looking at the parked car. She saw her reflection, older, yes, but unbroken. She turned off the light and let the quiet settle, not as surrender, but as something earned. Margaret had lived her whole life carefully, stretching money, raising a child, surviving loss. She wasn't reckless now. She was deliberate. Andrew mistook her silence for weakness. He always had. But silence, Margaret knew, could also be strategy. And this time, she was done being managed. The world hadn't taken her voice. She had simply chosen when to use it. That evening, Andrew called again. Margaret watched the phone vibrate across the table like something trapped and frantic. She let it ring out. When the house finally went quiet, she made herself soup and ate slowly, savoring the simple comfort of heat and salt. Independence, she had learned, wasn't loud. It didn't slam doors or shout accusations. It lived in small choices, what you ate, where you went, when you answered. Andrew had spent years deciding those things for her, without ever asking. He called it helping. Margaret called it erasure. As she washed her bowl, she imagined him explaining the situation to his wife, using words like concern and safety. "She's getting forgetful," he would say. "I'm just trying to manage things." That was always his favorite word, manage. He managed her money, her schedule, her reputation. What he never managed was respect. Margaret dried her hands and looked around the kitchen she had paid for, cleaned for, lived in. She hadn't survived widowhood and decades of responsibility just to be managed like a misplaced file. The following morning, Margaret woke before sunrise. She dressed carefully, choosing her navy cardigan and sensible shoes. When she stepped outside, the air was cool and sharp. She walked to the bus stop with her folder tucked under her arm, standing straight among commuters who barely noticed her. At 76, invisibility came easily, but Margaret didn't mistake it for weakness. At her lawyer's office, she sat across from him calmly. "I want to revise everything," she said. "My will, medical directives, financial authority." He nodded, pen already moving. "Your son is currently listed." "Remove him," Margaret replied without hesitation. There was no anger in her voice, only finality. They spoke for over an hour, revising details, clarifying intentions. When he asked if this was due to a disagreement, she answered simply, "It's due to clarity." Some relationships, she had learned, didn't improve with conversation. They improved with boundaries written in ink. On the ride home, Margaret watched trees blur past the bus window. Autumn had begun its slow takeover, edges of leaves turning gold. She thought about Andrew as a boy, skinned knees, stubborn pride, the way he used to reach for her hand crossing the street. Somewhere along the way, that boy had learned that control looked like love. And she had let it happen longer than she should have. Not because she was weak, but because mothers were trained to endure quietly. At home, she found another missed call and a text. "We need to talk." Margaret deleted it. She wasn't avoiding conversation. She was refusing interrogation. She made tea and sat at the table, reviewing the revised documents on her tablet. Each line felt like reclaiming ground she didn't realize she'd surrendered. She wasn't cutting Andrew off from love. She was cutting him off from authority. There was a difference, and it mattered. That afternoon, Lily stopped by. She knocked lightly, the way she always had, never assuming. "Hey, Grandma," she said, stepping inside. "You okay?" Margaret smiled. "I'm better than okay." Lily glanced toward the driveway. "Dad's stressed." Margaret raised an eyebrow. "That sounds inconvenient for him." Lily laughed, then sobered. "He didn't mean to hurt you." Margaret met her eyes gently. "Intent doesn't cancel impact." Lily nodded slowly. "I think you're doing the right thing." That meant more than Margaret expected. They sat together, sipping tea, talking about ordinary things, books, work, nothing urgent. When Lily left, she hugged Margaret tightly. "I'm proud of you," she whispered. Margaret held on to that sentence long after the door closed. As night fell, Margaret placed the car keys neatly back into the bowl by the door. She wasn't keeping them as a trophy. She was keeping them as punctuation, a pause, not a period. Andrew would come back eventually, full of explanations and apologies shaped to regain control. When he did, the conversation would be different. because Margaret would be different. She had remembered who she was. Not fragile, not confused, not waiting to be guided. Just a woman who knew the weight of her own life and had decided to carry it herself again. Silence filled the house, not heavy, not lonely, but settled. Earned. And for the first time in a long while, Margaret slept without bracing herself for the morning. The next morning, Andrew returned with a different tone. His knock was softer this time, uncertain. "Mom," he called through the door. "I'm not here to fight." Margaret remained seated at the kitchen table, finishing her toast.
She didn't rush.
When she finally opened the door, she didn't step aside. She stayed exactly where she was, blocking the entry without touching him. "You sold my car," she said calmly. Andrew sighed. "I did what was best for you." Margaret tilted her head. "You did what was easiest for you." That landed harder than shouting ever could. He tried to explain insurance, safety features, convenience. She listened without interrupting. When he finished, she spoke quietly.
"You didn't ask."
"That's the problem. You decided I was done deciding." Andrew frowned. "You're taking this personally." Margaret met his eyes. "It is personal." Andrew shifted his weight, uncomfortable. "You took my car," he said, attempting humor. "That was a little dramatic." Margaret didn't smile. "No," she replied.
"It was
illustrative."
He scoffed.
"So what, we're even?" Margaret shook her head slowly. "We were never even. I paid for that car. I paid for your taxes, your emergencies, your silence." His mouth opened, then closed. He hadn't expected numbers. Or memory. "I helped you," he insisted. "You helped yourself feel in control," Margaret corrected. "There's a difference." She stepped back then, allowing him inside. Not as permission, but as choice. He looked around the house like it no longer belonged to him. And in a way, it didn't. They sat across from each other at the kitchen table. The same one where he'd grown up doing homework, where she'd balanced bills and packed lunches. "I changed the bank access," Margaret said. Andrew stiffened. "You what?" "You no longer have it," she replied evenly. "And you won't again." His voice sharpened. "You think I was stealing from you?" Margaret held his gaze. "I think you forgot whose life this is." Silence stretched. Finally, Andrew muttered, "You're pushing me away." Margaret sighed softly.
"No."
"I'm stepping back. There's a difference." He stood abruptly. "This is extreme." She nodded. "So was selling my car." Andrew paced the kitchen, frustration written into every step. "What do you want from me?" he demanded. Margaret considered the question carefully. "Respect," she said. "Not obedience. Not gratitude. Respect." He laughed bitterly. "You're acting like I'm the enemy." Margaret's voice remained steady. "You're acting like I don't exist unless it's convenient." That stopped him. He stared at the floor, jaw tight. For a moment, Margaret almost reached for him. Old habits died hard. But she didn't. This wasn't about comfort. This was about truth. "I raised you to stand on your own," she continued. "Not to stand on me." Andrew grabbed his jacket. "I need time," he muttered. Margaret nodded.
"Take it."
When the door closed behind him, Margaret didn't collapse. She didn't cry. She poured herself tea and sat by the window, watching afternoon lights stretch across the lawn. Boundaries, she knew now, were not acts of cruelty. They were acts of care for herself first. Andrew would decide who he wanted to be in the absence of control. That wasn't her work anymore. She glanced at the empty driveway, then at her reflection in the glass. Older, yes, but clearer than she'd been in years. Whatever came next, it would come on her terms. The house settled into a different rhythm after Andrew left. Not emptier, just honest. Margaret moved through her days without bracing herself for interruption. She cooked when she was hungry, slept when she was tired, and let unanswered messages remain unanswered. Word traveled, as it always did. A neighbor mentioned seeing Andrew's car parked elsewhere. Another asked gently if everything was all right. Margaret smiled and said, "Everything is exactly as it should be." She meant it. She wasn't trying to punish her son or teach him a lesson. She was reclaiming space she had slowly surrendered over years of quiet accommodation. There was relief in that, and something sturdier than relief: confidence. She had not lost her family. She had simply corrected the terms under which they knew her. One afternoon, Lily returned, carrying groceries Margaret hadn't asked for but appreciated. "I didn't come to mediate," she said quickly. "Good," Margaret replied, amused. They cooked together, chopping vegetables and talking about ordinary things. At one point, Lily hesitated. "Dad's having a hard time," she admitted. Margaret nodded. "Growth usually is." Lily looked at her thoughtfully. "You're not angry, are you?" Margaret considered it. "No," she said finally. "I'm done negotiating my worth." Lily smiled, a quiet, relieved expression. She helped clean up, kissed Margaret's cheek, and said, "You taught me something." Margaret watched her go, heart full in a way that felt earned, not demanded. A week later, Margaret returned to her lawyer's office to sign the final documents. Her signature was steady. When she left, she felt the weight of completion, not finality, but readiness. At home, she opened the drawer again and removed the note she had written days earlier. She reread it once, then tore it neatly in half. Some messages didn't need delivering. The point had already been made. She placed Andrew's car keys on the hallway table and stepped back. She wasn't keeping them. Control had never been the prize. Choice was. She opened the front door and let the afternoon breeze move through the house like a blessing. Andrew came by that evening. He didn't knock right away. When he finally did, Margaret opened the door without hesitation. They stood there quietly for a moment. "I didn't realize," he said, his voice lower, stripped of performance. Margaret nodded. "You didn't want to," he swallowed. "I thought I was helping." "You were helping yourself feel needed," she replied gently. He glanced at the keys. "I'll arrange to get your car back," he said. Margaret studied him. "Good," she said. "And next time you ask." He nodded. It wasn't forgiveness. It was acknowledgement. And for now, that was enough. After he left, Margaret closed the door and leaned against it briefly, not from exhaustion but from awareness. She had crossed something invisible and important. Independence wasn't loud. It didn't require witnesses. It lived in moments like this: quiet evenings, open windows, decisions made without permission. Margaret poured herself tea and sat in her favorite chair as the light faded. She thought of Thomas, of the woman she had been, and the woman she still was. Not diminished by age, but clarified by it. The world would continue to underestimate her. That was fine. She no longer underestimated herself. Thanks for watching. If you value stories of respect, dignity, and justice, please subscribe. It means more than you know, and it lets me keep sharing the lessons life has carved into me.